got a big test coming up on the U.S. Constitution. Or, maybe you just want to get what the blueprint for American government is all about without digging through some super dense textbook. Well, you're in the right place. We're about to take one student's class notes and turn them into the ultimate explainer. So let's just dive right in.
Yeah, seeing this on a syllabus can be a little intimidating. But seriously, don't worry. We're going to walk through everything together. The Constitution itself, the branches of government, all the big debates, and we're going to use these notes as our guide. By the end of this, you are going to have it all down, I promise.
So where does the story of the Constitution even begin? Well, funnily enough, it actually starts with a failure, a big one. The very first government for the brand new United States, it just flat out wasn't working.
Okay, so picture this. The revolution is over. America's won its independence from Britain. Now the 13 states have to figure out how to work together. Their first shot at a plan was this document called the Articles of Confederation. You can basically think of it as America's first rule book.
This little flashcard here nails it. It was the first plan for American government, but the key word there is first, because, spoiler alert, it was definitely not the last. So why did it fail so badly?
Well, this slide, which is straight from the study notes, lays out all the problems perfectly. The main issue? The national government was just way too weak. I mean, look at this list. It couldn't collect taxes, so it couldn't pay its war debts. There was no president to enforce the laws, no national court to settle arguments between states. Each state was basically its own little country, doing its own thing, with its own money. It was total chaos. Okay, so clearly something had to give. The leaders from the states all gathered for what we now call the Constitutional Convention. Now, their original goal was just to tweak the articles, but they pretty quickly realized they needed to scrap the whole thing and start over. And that kicked off a massive debate.
And the entire debate really boiled down to this one huge question. How do you make a government that's fair to both the big states, the ones with a lot of people, and the small states with way fewer? Everybody had an opinion, and two major plans ended up taking center stage.
So in one corner, you had the Virginia Plan. This was the big states idea, pushed by guys like James Madison. It was simple. The more people your state has, the more representatives, and thus more power you get in the government. But in the other corner, the small states fired back with the New Jersey Plan. They wanted equal representation. One state, one vote, just like it was in the old articles. They were at a complete standstill.
And I'm not kidding. The whole convention almost fell apart right then and there. The only way they could move forward was to compromise. They had to find some middle ground that both sides could live with, even if nobody was going to get exactly what they wanted.
And that brings us to what's famously known as the Great Compromise. Just like the flashcard says, this was the big agreement that finally solved that whole big state versus little state fight. So what was this brilliant solution?
They basically just decided to do both. They created a Congress with two houses, or a bicameral legislature. In the House of Representatives, representation would be based on population. That made the big states happy. And in the Senate, every single state would get 2 senators, no matter its size. That made the small states happy. It was a mashup of both plans, and it actually worked.
But solving one problem created another, much darker one. Now that population was a key part of how power was divided, a terrible question came up. How should enslaved people be counted?
As these notes show, this was an incredibly ugly debate. The southern states wanted to count enslaved people in their population to get more representatives and more political power. The northern states, on the other hand, argued that if enslaved people were legally considered property, then they shouldn't be counted for representation at all. The result was a grim deal known as the 3/5 Compromise. For every 5 enslaved people, 3 would be counted toward a state's population for both representation and for taxes. It was a terrible compromise, and it was written right into the Constitution, giving slaveholding states a huge amount of power for decades.
So with those major fights settled, the framers could finally get down to designing the actual structure of the government. How would they organize it to make sure it was strong enough to work, but not so strong that it became tyrannical? Their solution was pretty brilliant. They split the government's power into 3 separate parts, or branches. First, you have the legislative branch, that's Congress, and their job is to make the laws. Second, the executive branch, which is the president, and their job is to enforce those laws. And third, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court and the court system. Their job is to interpret the laws.
But here's the secret sauce. They didn't want any one of those branches to get too big for its britches. So, to prevent that, they created this amazing system called checks and balances. Each branch was given specific powers to limit or check the power of the other two.
And this page of notes shows exactly how it works. For instance, Congress can pass a law, right? But the president can veto it and say, nope. But wait, Congress can then override that veto if they get enough votes. And then you have the courts, which can look at that law and declare it unconstitutional. It's this constant game of push and pull that keeps the whole system from going off the rails.
Okay, so the plan is written, the design is done, the job's finished, right? Not even close. Now the framers had to go out and convince the entire country to actually approve this new constitution. And let me tell you, not everyone was sold on the idea.
This whole approval process was called ratification, and it was a massive gamble. As you can see, they needed at least 9 of the 13 states to vote yes. If they didn't get 9, the whole thing would just fall apart. And this set off a fierce, nationwide debate.
So on one side, you had the Federalists. These were guys like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. They were all in on the Constitution, arguing that the country desperately needed a strong national government to fix all those problems from the Articles of Confederation. But on the other side, you had the Anti-Federalists. They were really worried this new government was too powerful. They were afraid the president could become like a king, and they were especially concerned that the Constitution didn't have enough protections for people's individual rights.
In the end, the Federalists won the argument. And the power of their vision really starts with the first 3 words of the Constitution's introduction: "We the people." This was a completely radical idea at the time. It was a declaration that the government's power didn't come from a king, it didn't even come from the states, it came directly from the citizens themselves.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've seen how a failed government led to a huge battle of ideas, which led to some really difficult compromises, and finally, to a brand new design for a government. It was a plan forged over 200 years ago. Which leaves us with a big question to think about. How well is that blueprint holding up in the world today?